Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica of John Dee, using the translation that Dr. Nancy Turner and I did that came out from Ouroboros Press in 2021. This is also a continuation of Class 3 on the letter to Maximilian that prefaces Dee's theorems. If you have made it this far through the letter, congratulations. We're going to get to the end of the letter in this video, and you will be one of the very few people in the world who actually understand this letter. People have said you can't understand it. Yes, you can. A lot of the problem is with translation, but an even larger part is not taking the time. And if you are here with me in this fourth installment of Class 3, you have taken the time. So awesome. Here we go. This is part 4 of Class 3, and we're going to get to the end of the letter. You know the frontispiece of the monad by now. You know we're talking about the letter to Maximilian. If you haven't listened to the 3 videos that come before this, I just want to warn you, you probably want to go back and do that. We've talked about context. We've gone through a lot of wordplay, and just jumping in now may be a painful experience. We've read through and explicated in the last video the 3rd section of the letter, and here we're going to go on to the end. Dee has taken us through a list of professions who can benefit from exposure to and understanding of his monad. They include grammarians. A grammarian to Dee is not what it is to you or most people, or or to me for that matter. A grammarian to Dee, since he set up this context of geometric forms and sacred alphabets, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, creating the world, is basically telling you that a grammarian is talking about how language and form have structured creation. Anyway, he talks about other people and how they can benefit: mathematicians, musicians, crystal gazers, Kabbalists, and physicians, among others. And that last section we went through contains some of the densest wordplay in the monad. Because of that, I made several helping videos. I have links to them below again, but for example, explaining his word for a talisman or seal, Gemea, his vo archidamus, which is an allusion to the vo archidumia panteo, his arieton, which is a made-up Latin word about Aries and taking the form of Aries, and he has all kinds of puns on red earth, Adam, and atoms, because they all come from either the single or plural of the same Hebrew word. He also discussed his real as opposed to spoken Kabbalah. I'm going to talk about that too in a later video, because Athanasius Kircher picks it up whole cloth and just quotes it when Kircher is talking about Kabbalah. So let's go on here. We're going to first review some terms that we've used before in light of Plato and Socrates' theory of forms and the idea of the good in the Republic. We're going to look at this most delightfully strange Aesop's fable and see that it's really a prod to read the tree in Genesis anagogically and Kabbalistically. He's also going to talk about the problem of dividing letters correctly. He'll signal this is important by putting them in all caps and in Greek. And then he goes on a bit about poor grammarians before he flatters the king a little bit more, appeals to him for protection, offers him his offspring, which is the monad, hopes that it's a fortunate event, and says amen. So please remember a few things here. We're trying, as I've said before, to understand this in the context of Dee and his time and the values he presents himself as sharing with the king. To really understand this section, you need to understand the concept of the good from Plato's Republic, as well as his concepts of form, shade, and the boundary line. I have given a link below to some explanations of that from a very good philosophy explicator, or you can also just read the Republic, book 6 and 7. You will notice that when Dee lists off a bunch of philosophers, he doesn't name Plato. He doesn't name Pythagoras. That's because they are so obvious within the context that he's talking about and would be to Maximilian. It would be like if I talked to another American about the President of the United States and I had to say that president, oh, and this dude, he's the president of the US. I wouldn't say that because it would be so obvious. We'd already know. That's how these references to the Republic are in the letter to Maximilian. I've mentioned before, I'm not trying to teach Latin or Greek grammar. I will explain some of it when it's necessary to understand the concept. Same is true to references to alchemical and philosophical texts, even beyond the Republic. I have made several helping videos on the word plays in this section and others to help out, so please check those out if you're interested. Let's go ahead and get started here. We left off before with this section here where he's talking about the monad and says, it must itself work in two ways, both binding in duty and carrying forth. The reader absorbs the work and becomes worthy by imitating its worthiness. There's the idea that this monad, which he said is a talisman, has absorbed divine energy, and now, as you understand it, it's projecting that energy out to you, or that you are absorbing that energy by going through all the transformations he's going to take you through in the theorems. I want to use the opening of the next section to review a few words. He says, may you now agree, O King Maximilian, you honored by the glorious threefold crown, that I have said enough. I fear more than enough, if common men have here heard of the rarity of this homage of theorems of mine. I hope you will also agree that it is a gift whose quality is defined by its very goodness. We've talked about how rarity or raritatis is our meaning of rarity, but more. Also, it can mean something very succinct. It can even refer to a slim volume of prose. But in that case, it's succinct in a little bit of a different way. It's because it's compressed. It has compressed symbols, for example, like D has here. Homage. In the very beginning of the letter to Maximilian, I pointed out that D uses an unusual word for gift. He uses munum instead of donum. That has the connotation of an offering, an homage. So we've here translated it as homage. The most important here, though, is the idea of goodness. Plato's idea of the good, the bonitatis. The good will also be part of the Gnostic ascent to the one. It's a really important concept in Neoplatonism. I snagged this from another open video, and I've given you the link below, hoping you will watch it, because that gentleman does an excellent job of explicating books 6 and 7 of Plato's Republic. But let me just review a few things quickly. First of all, he's going to, in this section, talk a lot about shadows and shade. Now, in terms of Kabbalah, there's a tree of life, but there's a tree of shade, the Qliphothic tree. There are also shadows in the Republic. If you know the allegory of the cave, Plato's allegory of the cave, that's in the Republic. Then we'll get to the actual world of physical objects. It's mediated here by what you know about this world, according to Socrates, according to Plato, because of the sun, S-U-N, which of course in Neoplatonism is always a pun on S-O-N, the Son of God. But it's the idea that if you see an eagle flying, well, you see it. The optics and light is super important. So you see it. That's how you know what it is. Or the sun hits a rock, so you see it. You know it's a rock. Now, yes, we now consider this pretty discriminatory against people who can't see, but I want you to know the concept as it exists from Socrates. All right, so this is what you can see. This is less important here, what is visible, whether the sun is shining on it or it's in the shade, than everything above this, which is the invisible world. And we've seen D earlier in the letter talk about things suddenly becoming invisible. This is the world of thought. The world of thought is much more important to him. You do the work of Euclid, of Apollonius, pardon me, doing geometry. You have that helping hand helping you through the proof. You may be drawing some things out, but mainly you're thinking. And that is where you get this word dianoia that we also talked about in an earlier video, that literally means the revolving of thought. You have questions and answers and you work your way through. Then you get up to the world of pure form, Plato's world of forms. And then finally, at the apex of this cone that D really loves, you have the form of the good. Okay? Make sure you know that whenever you see D talk about something as good, that's also why he puts it in all caps. So let's go ahead and keep going here. We're going to go now into the strangest Aesop's fable that I've ever seen. I just love it. So the next thing he says here is this: be it enough, O you singularly dignified among all kings, that we have here diligently demonstrated our rare gift, the monad, so much so that nobody, no Aesopian bird, even one with the most scurrilous, petulant, and envious tongue, can grumble about it. For it is so great that justly would it be free from such false accusations and indignities as all the most modest and most wise philosophers will grant. They will not disdain to sing with me the praise and honor of that phoenix from whose singular compassionate wings we have plucked with fear and love all of these theoretical plumes over and against our nudity, the introduction of Adam. And I'm going to stop there with Adam, because if you were thinking, gee, this is 3 centuries BC that Aesop is writing those fables, and as far as I know, he was a Greek slave, and he wasn't a Jewish Greek slave, so why is he referring to Adam? He's not. There is no Aesop's fable that refers to biblical characters, unless it's some adaptation of one. There is also not a bird named here. So we're going to try to figure out what bird it is. But you probably know about Aesop's fables usually having a moral. And so there are several that involve birds that have scurrilous, petulant, and envious tongues. There are several that don't really involve birds, that involve false accusations, and that being the path to tyranny. You remember at the beginning of the letter to Maximilian, D presented that Pythagorean why one path led to being a philosopher king, the other led to being a tyrant. There's a one about the wolf and a lamb, for example, where the moral is that accusing and punishing people falsely just because you have power is the path to tyranny. So that hooks back directly to that Pythagorean why that D had at the beginning of the letter. So what other fables might this remind us of? Hopefully we'll find one in there with a bird. There's another problem when we get to Adam, that he's conflating things. He loves to conflate things, but the way that he is going to tell the story of Adam, as we will see, is very different from the usual moral of that story. It has potentially the opposite meaning. Okay, now, Aesop's bird fable, well, there's cranes. I mean, there's a bunch of birds, not just the ones I have here, but a peacock, a jackdaw, crows, jays, cranes, but there is not a phoenix, okay? The Library of Congress Berry Index that lists all of them lists not one phoenix. So what is his bird? Well, at least that one is easy. Since we know that alchemy is one of his many subtexts, it's got to be the peacock, right? Why? Because the peacock's tail is a very important alchemical metaphor. It's a symbol for a particular phase of alchemy where the oily black gunk in the alembic suddenly turns iridescent. Think of, after a rain, the sun hitting water and in an oil slick, and you see that iridescent rainbow-like glitter on the oil slick. It's that phase. So Kunrath, an alchemist of Dee's era, just a bit younger than Dee, says that the peacock as a symbol integrating all polarities may be called the soul of the world, nature, the quintessence, which causes all things to bring forth. And there is the peacock. It's the cover bird from this video. There are a couple Aesop's fables about peacocks, and I talked about them in my video on this fable, and they do have to do with envy and not being happy with what you have. So hence the reference, which Dee knows that Maximilian would know, about a envious bird, a petulant bird, a scurrilous bird. So we might say, if we are looking at the stages of alchemy, oh, okay, so we're going from the peacock to the phoenix. Why would we think that? Because the philosopher's stone itself is sometimes described as a phoenix. I mean, think of it. You know the story of the phoenix, right? It rises from the ashes. It rises up and eventually it bursts into flames and dies, and then it's reborn from its own ashes. It's a cycle not unlike that of the Ouroboros serpent, and it's deeply associated with alchemy. You can see a similar kind of bird in other traditions, or the phoenix itself in the Chinese tradition. That bird is translated as a phoenix, but you can also think of the Bennu bird, the Simorgh bird, the Russian firebird. Now, what we are looking for, since I've previously told you that with Adam, we might look at Adam and his unfortunate experience with the tree as being about the tree of life. So if we start looking for birds that are like at the top of a tree, we get eagles, we get something like Attar's Conference of the Birds, where you have a Simorgh bird. D, or somebody writing as D, uses that very example in another work attributed to D. I'm thinking of the Tuba veneris. So we can think of other birds at the top of trees. But then he's going to conflate the peacock phoenix with Genesis 2. So we need to ask why he's doing that. And as I mentioned, this is the first use of the actual Adam word in Latin rather than the Hebrew aleph, dalet, mem. Remember, D is interested in anagogic interpretations, not literal interpretations. So the literal interpretation of the book of Genesis might be, there's Adam, he's lonely, and now Adam has a wife, and his bad wife eats an apple and causes all the problems of humanity, and that's because they're cast out of the Garden of Eden. No, I don't particularly like that interpretation, but that's what you would mean by a literal interpretation of that part. Now, there's all kinds of problems, like around the block, it seems there's another creation story going on, but it doesn't matter. D is not interested in literal interpretations. The fourth type of interpretation is anagogic. That has to do with the highest level of scriptural exegesis and the ascent of the soul. Think of the Gnostic ascent to the one. So how would that change things? Well, the tree, as I have already mentioned, would become the tree of life. If you haven't watched my earlier videos, I have talked previously about why I'm using the Kircher tree. I know there are lots of other diagrams of the tree. We're talking Hermetic and Christian Kabbalah, and the Kircher tree you can reverse engineer into the tree that D is using. But let's look at how your understanding of how Genesis books 2 and 3, which are the chapters about Adam, Eve, and the tree, change if you read this anagogically as the tree of life. I want to digress briefly about biblical translations. I should have done this before. D is mainly using the Latin Vulgate. Where Nancy and I use the Latin Vulgate, we translated from the Latin Vulgate. There were the very first vernacular English translations coming out at that time, like the Geneva Bible. They were very controversial because England was also in the middle of this big religious shift and shift back and shift. So there's a whole political thing going on with the Bible. But if you don't know that and you think, oh, Old Bible must be King James. No, the King James Bible is more than 50 years later. It's almost a century later. And while it is a beautiful, beautiful literary work, it is a terrible translation. You get all kinds of ideas coming in that are not actually in either the Hebrew Bible, they're not in the Greek New Testament, and that is a whole nother huge discussion for people who are interested in the King James Bible, which I am not interested in at all. So I'm using here the Geneva Bible, which is close to, if not, what D would have used. Genesis 2:25, we know that they were both naked, man and wife, and they were not ashamed. Just sort of, that's how it is, they're naked. Then Eve is seduced by the serpent. Now, if we read this as the serpent on the tree of life, what do we have? Well, if we're talking about now or D's time, as opposed to some hypothetical time of creation, the fall has already happened. So the serpent on the tree of life is how you ascend up this middle pillar from Malkuth. Yes, some of you may have as part of your knowledge lectures in a hermetically based initiatory order, one of the multiple Golden Dawn spin-offs, for example, studied a serpent on the tree of life. That's exactly the same thing. That's one of the big reasons that I think those knowledge lectures in cipher manuscript were crafted by someone who knew the hieroglyphic monad very well and with the esoteric explanation that I am giving you. So then let's go on to Genesis 3:5. Your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods if you eat from the tree. You will be as gods if you eat from the tree. Well, we're not supposed to do that, are we? Yes. If you are working your way up the tree, you are trying to learn anew what was lost at the fall from Tiferet to Malkuth. Adam obeys his wife. He eats from the tree. Adam suddenly, because he eats from the tree, I guess he realizes, oh, you don't have a name. Okay, you're Eve. He calls his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. Now, remember in the last section, I talked about a gameia, a talisman that Dee then explains as gamos Gaian. Gaian is an allusion to Gaia, the Greek goddess who burst the Titans and then much of Greek mythology. How would that play out on the tree? Well, you have the flash of divine energy into Kether, kind of like the point at the top of the cone of the good. And it flows down into the second Sephirah, Chokhmah, and blasts over to Bina, which gives it form. And from this form, Bina manifests the universe. That's just simple Hermetic Kabbalah. And that is what you would equate to Adam calling his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. She manifests the universe. Now, I submit that's directly opposed to the literal interpretation of Eve causing all the problems, because by this, for one thing, the problems have already been caused. We're at Malkuth, not Tiferet, by this Hermetic understanding of the Kabbalah. Let's continue on. Genesis 3:22. Well, you know Dee is going to love Genesis 3:22, almost whatever it is, because why? He's obsessed with significant numbers. And what do we have here? 22, the letters, the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet, which according to the Sefer Yetzirah manifest all of creation. And 3, the number of the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and many other things most significant to Dee, the 3 sacred languages, Hebrew, Greek, Latin. So the quote is this: God said, behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree and eat and live forever. What does this mean, to know good and evil? Well, remember, there is another tree that I mentioned, the tree of shades, the Qophotic tree or Qophotic tree. So man now knows both of them and is supposed to take the path of the serpent on the tree of life to attain the wisdom and divinity that man had in Tiferet. So then you have the quote from Genesis 23-24, the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the earth whence he was taken. Thus he cast out the man, and at the east side of the Garden of Eden he set the cherubim and the blade of a sword shaken to keep the way of the tree of life. What does that mean? Okay, there is an idea of the shattering of the vessels, and I'm going to talk about that more in the next slide. But the blade of the sword shaken is this flash of light that is sometimes called a lightning flash, but as it flashes down this middle pillar, it is called sometimes a flaming sword. So that is the blade of the sword shaken, because the original Edenic tree by this Hermetic line of thought has been shaken, and in fact the vessels, the Sephirah, shattered. So we might think there, if you have studied Lurianic Kabbalah, how much Dee could have known about the rabbinical idea of tikkun olam that is talked about a lot today in synagogues, and it's a beautiful idea. It's the idea of your work to heal the world being a repairing of the shattered vessels. This idea meshes with it perfectly. The problem is that's really associated with Lurianic Kabbalah, and Rabbi Luria is still in Egypt at this time. He hasn't started his teachings. So more on that in my other video on this. But while the ideas mesh, I don't think you can really jump in and say he's doing Lurianic Kabbalah, because there is no Lurianic Kabbalah at this time. Now, there may be earlier ideas of Tikkun Olam, and you can work with that. But let's just keep going here. After you have that Aesopian fable, he says, although we have in no way here leaned upon or taken in hand other human authority, we are able to take the opportunity to place in the correct light some notable maxims and writings. In a friendly way, we amuse ourselves by writing how our latter work reveals things about some of the philosophers of the greatest antiquity. For example, we will descend from our hieroglyphic demonstrations into certain mysteries of Hermes, Ostanes, Pythagoras, Democritus, and Anaxagoras. By the way, he does mention Pythagoras here. I apologize. He doesn't mention Plato. But we will talk about what he does here when we get to the theorems, okay? He's just rattling off, these are the people I'm going to refer to. And he's already talked about his monad symbol as his London seal of Hermes. Okay, as we've noted before, for D, a hieroglyph is just a packed symbol. It's a significant symbol, very, very significant, but it has a totally different set of meanings. Hiero, if you know the word hierophant, that's the hiero and glyph. So there are people who have translated the first book of Egyptian hieroglyphs, the hieroglyphs of Apollo, and Anthony Grafton and George Boas both agree that the way people understood Egyptian hieroglyphs then was horrible. I mean, now people make fun of Budge. Well, Budge was much closer than these guys were. But there was a sort of Egyptian hieroglyphic fad in the Renaissance. That's not at all what D is doing here. However, there is a fun little fact I'd like to share. I've talked a lot about King Maximilian's great-grandfather and namesake, Maximilian I, being a great patron of hermeticists, alchemists. He was himself an alchemist, and so on. Well, he was gifted with a translation of the hieroglyphics of Apollo that was bound together with Aesop's fables, illustrated by the great artist Albert Dürer. So that's kind of cool. Just thought I'd drop that in there. We'll keep going. Next, D says, and that meanwhile, as the very great rarity, as has been said, everywhere yoked together and attended by goodness, where nothing we testify. He's testifying, like not on a Bible, but on the Platonic conception of the good. Where nothing we testify, neither in the open or under cover, is here posited that is not honest, sincere, suitable for human dignity, and useful for the pursuit of most perfect piety and religion. And certainly in such arduous mysteries, not only he who can divide the signs correctly. He writes this in the original, not in Latin, but in all caps, all Greek. So let me read to the end, and then I'm going to explain this. Only he who can divide the signs correctly can clearly teach about them, and that same person must have most thoroughly inspected all amplitudes. In this way, there would be nobody who would wish to reveal his childishness, malice, or arrogance by daring to reject as frivolous or condemning as impious what we have here most condemned to your wisdom. And he emphasizes that this is important by writing it in the Latin in caps, small caps, except for this word. This orthotomine is in ancient Greek a word that people who are explaining the Bible explain it the way I'm about to talk about. There's a point in the second book of Timothy where the unusual word is used in because the New Testament is, of course, in Greek. Literally, it means to cut rightly, because there's a problem of biblical people who are explaining the New Testament of lopping off part of a Greek word and not knowing, thinking it's part of the next word and not realizing it's part of the previous word because they are so poor at Greek. So it has been taken to mean correctly dividing or explaining the word of truth, the whole New Testament. And so one should be careful not to divide a Greek word the wrong way. D is talking about this in terms of his monad also. And we will see that he is at pains to say, this is why you can divide the monad in certain ways. And there are some types of division he never does. Okay, let's continue on. He says, since in this matter, no one could call a witness possessing more incisive evidence or greater expertise, nor one with stronger authority or more trustworthy sincerity than him who has the most high and omnipotent King of Kings has created in King Maximilian. Oh my gosh, yes, he is sucking up to the king of, basically, he's saying here, if the king approves of this, it doesn't matter what other people think. Now, if you look at it in the context of Dee's time, Maximilian, who is soon to become the Holy Roman Emperor, is thought to be God's emissary on earth. So there is a reason beyond obsequiousness that he is flattering Maximilian so much. But it also would make Dee's life much easier if Maximilian thought, oh, this is awesome. I'll just put a hieroglyphic monad symbol right behind me on the throne, or something analogous to that. Okay. King Maximilian, so will the presence of your august majesty here outweigh that of all others, that you have approved and ratified this work will not only silence the mouths of many good-for-nothings hiding in the castle of grammar. Later, Dee will talk about how Elizabeth I is a witness to the sacred mysteries of his monad. He'll try to explain it to Maximilian's son, Rudolph II, when he and Kelly are in Prague a couple of decades later. Okay, this castle of grammar, this is another strange Latin word. Dee may have made it up. I think it's probably just in some text that is still lost. So he liked grammar so much. Why is he talking about this? What he means is people who are obsessing on now what we would call grammar. That is, oh, well, in Latin, there's all these case endings. And so you can have very long sentences, but you got to get the case endings right. So he's talking about some grammarian who does something like, oh, well, this can't go here. It's got to go here. And so what you're saying just is wrong, rather than focusing on the essence of the words, which may be obvious. I find it kind of entertaining that if he invented this word, it's even more entertaining, or if he is just one of the only people that uses it. That, but in 1785, there is actually a Latin grammar text named this. Okay, I know I'm easily entertained, but I think that's kind of hilarious. So there's a Latin grammar reader and text called the Grammaticastrorum. All right. The good-for-nothings hiding in the castle of grammar, but also raise up the souls of many philosophers, which until now lay low because of the alleged uncertainty of such mysteries. They also fear the judgments of the proudly ignorant, those who rashly and promiscuously, solely out of superficial similarity in name, condemn good and bad studies alike. And why? Because they're proudly ignorant. You might think of some modern concept like the Dunning-Kruger effect, that people who don't know a lot tend to be a lot more confident in their beliefs than people who know a lot more about a subject. So they condemn good and bad studies alike. This has led to the most bitter lamenting for some of the most virtue-filled books that have occasionally perished because some ignorant person has declared this is awful, and so the work perishes. Each of the two sorts, Dee says, have harmed the Christian Republic. In other words, both those who remain silent and don't defend good works and those who condemn things they know nothing about. And when this is Plato's Republic has become the Neoplatonic Christian Republic, hopefully ruled by the wise philosopher King Maximilian. One can clearly agree. Forsooth, those with constitutions aptly fitted for grasping at such matters were yet thoroughly terrified for the reasons previously mentioned, or perhaps because the same rustic and proud judges had universally condemned the study of such divine and noble mysteries, despite having made not even mediocre progress in such studies themselves. Yet, this is not the place to compare each of the honest sciences to false ones, those shadowy, odious, irksome, and useless to human society that try to emulate them. We urge that those false sciences alone be exploded and condemned, and we grant that this should be explained with reasoning able to be understood and followed by common men, not only with common evidence, but with that made from every wise man. Several things here apply to all of this. if you recall the discussion I just had about the tree of life, and I mentioned there was a tree of shade, a shadowy tree. That's the qliphothic tree. So you can merge that idea with the idea of Plato's seamlessly. What do others like Plato have to say about the shadow? Look at Republic, book 6 and 7. When we get to the end of this, he wants the reasoning to be understood by common men, but he wants wise men to share their wise evidence from this world of forms. Dee has a very ambivalent attitude towards what he calls common men, as we'll see when we get to his letter to Printer Sylvius, which is the very next video. He continues on with the idea of shadow, saying, yet those of the most thin, shadowy sciences, they who will remain ignorant that such bodies do exist, or of where they exist, or of what qualities they are constituted, in what manner and by what right dare they condemn studies not intended for the masses, made by uncommon men, right? So something, just because something is popular doesn't make it great. I'm going to come back and talk about his idea of bodies here in a moment. And I've already mentioned this. With shadowy, think of the qliphothic tree, think of the idea of the allegory of the cave in the Republic. When Dee says, let there be justice, in all caps, his wording in Latin, fiat justitia, is, I think, an intentional echo of the fiat lux, or let there be light, from Genesis. And that let there be light that creates the great tree has become conflated with the geometric creation in the Timaeus and with the concept of the good from Plato. Shade is, of course, literally where the light is blocked in all of these cases. So the boundaries, which he is going to discuss here, I won't go into the great detail, but it's also an important concept in the Republic. That's why I suggested that you read it to understand this. All right. Let there be justice, and let each be assigned to his own. Let us ascribe all of their nonsense, errors, and impiety to these common dabblers who not only meddle in the shades of great arts, but likewise fabricate and adulterate them in the most wicked ways. Then, by their smooth-based calumny, they summon enmity into the name and studies, and a crisis into the life of those of confirmed honor and integrity. What is this crisis? Back to the Pythagorean why. Remember, right? There was a crossroads where the young man has to decide what way to go. That's the crisis. It's, I want to follow honor and integrity, but this person is saying this is the road to that, and really it's a road to vice or something along these lines. That, O king, seems to me not only inhumane, but even unjust and merely impious itself. For as all bodies whatsoever and all shadows whatsoever share boundary lines in common, again, in the Republic, with those self-same bodies, as we know very well in mathematics, in the same way, the genuine bodies and the shades and the phrase of speaking and writing, common boundary of word choice and style, as the wise must allow. Yet, where the inexperienced, thoughtless, and presumptuous apes try to grasp bare inane shadows, the wise philosophers enjoy the erudition of solid bodies and their most pleasing delights. A body is just a corpus, and it doesn't refer just to your human body, although there is still the very prevalent concept of the body as the model of all things, right? As above and so below, man is the measure of all things. But if you think of corpus as, say, the corpus hermeticum, it can be a body of work. And the way Dee is using it, a body is simply a form from Plato's world of forms, that invisible world that gives birth of things. So it also can then conflate with a Sephiroth. The Neoplatonic sun, and light mediates between physical objects. I talked about that before, and I am going to get to the Sephiroth on this next page, I guess. So he'll continue, but I will just finish that idea now. The idea is that form of that power of God, there are 10 powers of God that are divided up into the 10 Sephiroth, impress themselves in the same way as the light or a body of work like the corpus hermeticum. Okay, he continues. And if we discern how to make rightful use of that adage, that which they, those remaining in the shade, thought they had, a thing neither solid nor sound, would be most justly snatched from their hands. For it is necessary that bodies be divided from shadows. Divide the signs correctly. So he repeats in all caps, all Greek letters, this concept I've talked about before. Between shadow and body, in order to divide their boundaries, powers, and uses. In this way, justice, that royal and imperial sword, performs this divine service among many others. His imperial sword here is not like the sword of Damocles. This is that flaming sword of the lightning flash down the middle pillar of the tree of life. And he has written in the margins Luke 8:18 with an I there, because remember, he doesn't like Arabic ones. I don't mind them, so I've given you an Arabic one. In the Geneva Bible, that is, therefore consider carefully how you listen. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever does not have, even what they think they have will be taken from them. The idea often interpreted as, the things you think that a person thinks that that person has because they're puffed up by pride or arrogance. This I've already talked about. Consider, because of the way Dee is conflating things, that body or corpus can become a reference to Sephira, even though that's literally counting. But it is the 10 powers of God. And I've mentioned that corpus, it can be a work like Corpus Hermeticum. This imperial sword, along with the flaming sword down the middle pillar, takes us back to Stillbone on the frontispiece. And all of the references to this piercing mercury, because it becomes the same as philosophic mercury piercing the world of form and transmuting it. To continue, Dee says, and sometimes the wise craftsmen themselves admit these shadowy figures, finding them pleasing among the actual circuit of serpentine bodies. That's the serpent ascending the tree of life again, as we've talked about. Yet you would not refine the Hesperidian gardens, embracing them eagerly and braying, tendering the most elect lettuce at the time when wild thistles would be sufficient. All right, what's he doing here? Okay, I've already talked about the serpentine bodies, but I can be the serpent going up the middle pillar. It also alludes to the dragon Ladin, who guarded the golden apples of immortality in the garden of the Hesperides. The wise craftsman, again, is the wise craftsman, the god, the great geometer of Plato's Timaeus. And so now we have them conflated. So you have the wise craftsman has created these forms. It actually would be as the receptacle goes back up the tree, the serpentine path back up the tree of light. The goddess Hera's garden was in the west. That matches nicely with the Kabbalistic idea of being thrown out, right? So you're in the west. The Hesperides themselves are the nymphs of the sunset or evening, originally 3 in number, though, and he likes the number 3, though up to 7 different names are given. Notably, they're going to include the red one, dazzling light, and sunset glow, and sunset is red, yellow, and gold. Prickly lettuce is something that it was cultivated a lot because it's sacred to Aphrodite. So basically you can take this as a kind of pearls before swine kind of thing. Would be okay, so don't give them lettuce. But the braying is an allusion to an ass. And I want to talk about this ass for a moment here. Why does he suddenly have something braying? Well, there is a hidden common meaning of that to the path of initiation. I repeat, there is a hidden common meaning to that of the path of initiation. That's important. So it doesn't have anything to do with Hera's garden exactly, but you get this in, for example, the Metamorphosis, not of Ovid, although that's also an alchemical work, but the Metamorphosis of Apuleius, which is the only novel in classical Latin. And St. Augustine, decades later, refer to it as the golden ass. It's widely regarded as an allegory of initiation. So what happens as that ass goes up the path of initiation? he becomes the golden ass. Okay, and you see this in lots of places, and you maybe haven't known what it is. If you think of the play within a play in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, and Bottom, the rough workman who suddenly is turned into an ass, but he wakes up and has made love to the fairy queen, and the fairy queen wakes up and has made love to him. What's going on there? It's in part this path of initiation. He continues, "Pardon me, O king, for showing on the authority of Christ the injustice of the world. Nor do I wish that this subject, so especially brought to mind by your wisdom, be in any way in these times be considered superfluous." What he means by the authority of Christ is a reference to John 16:8, where Jesus reproves humans for their sins. Now we're going to get a long reference to an aphorism from Dee's other book, other book of theorems, the Propoinomata Aphoristica. So let me talk about this, and we're almost to the end of this letter. Dee says, "With regard to all said to this point, thus I now must humbly offer to your most serene majesty this my offspring, this the Hieroglyphic Monad, the whole work of theorems, and this letter and the symbol, conceived in London, yet verily born in Antwerp, where it was printed. I entreat you with all my strength that you not now disdain to be made godfather of the same, and that later, when it will be of a grander age." In Theorem 22, he's going to really talk about a grander age. We've got a ways to get there, but that's what he's referring to. That's also the mystical hypercube I've talked about earlier that he doesn't have any word for in the English of his time. "You not now disdain to be made a godfather of the same, and that later, when it will be of a grander age and truly more worthy of your praise, that it may always be in your presence serving you. I intend that, after this, it will become your own, O merciful king, for during all the time of its birthing, I beheld your most pleasing countenance before my eyes." And what? Well, remember in the very beginning, he talked about how he was at Maximilian's coronation and how just the sight of Maximilian so inspired him because of, Maximilian presumably is the agent of God on earth. It also, to us now, seems like shameless flattery, but that is the idea, divinity to Maximilian, inspiring Dee to the monad, and now he's giving the monad back. And it is what has caused the birth of his monad. "During all the time of its birthing, I beheld your most pleasing countenance before my eyes, and thus for the same reason you have made my labors in bringing forth this light of publishing an easy and unfettered one. For 7 continuous years, my mind gestated with these same ideas, but due to the strength of your magnetic virtue, it took only the space of 12 days in this place, ready to be of inspired service, to most gently give birth, like the magnetism of Maximilian just pulled it out of him." Okay. In the margin, he says, "as appears in our foundational aphorisms," that's the Propoinomata Aphoristica. And he's referring to aphorism 52. 52 is going to be a very important aphorism because of his obsession with the significance of numbers. Because 52 is what? The number of weeks in a year. How many days are in a week? 7. How many months? 12. At a certain point in the monad, he'll start making time measurements, space measurements also. It gets delightfully complicated until you remember that at a certain sense, his time and space measurements become the same. Okay, this is the Propoinomata Aphoristica, aphorism 52. It directly refers to the monad symbol because the same symbol is on both editions of the Propoinomata Aphoristica. If you were skilled in catoptrics, you will be able by art to imprint the rays of a star much more strongly upon any matter subjected to it than nature itself does. What? That's because of the idea that nature is down here and the one is up here. You're getting closer than nature. This indeed was by far the largest part of the natural philosophy of the ancient wise men, and this secret is not of much less dignity than the very august astronomy of the philosophers, called inferior. They'll have a whole section on inferior and superior astronomy, whose symbols, enclosed in a certain monad and taken from my theories, I send to you along with this treatise. And that was part of what he sent to Gerardus Mercator. I'm quoting here Shoemaker's translation, which was done back in the 70s. But Dee is basically describing making a talisman, but a talisman stronger than any talisman we have heard of. By the way, the other thing with this Born in Antwerp is that he wrote this while he was living with printer Willem Sylvius, and we're going to look at Sylvius's letter next. I've already talked about these as time measures. We're to the final paragraph. He says, may the most holy Trinity grant that this is a happy and fortunate event for your august highness and for my most ardent and sincere studies for truth, that which in the ineffable omnipotent monad, founded before all generations, lives and reigns eternally, to whom alone all praise, honor, virtue, and glory shall always be offered and sung by creatures. Before we amen this, this is kind of a gutsy sign off. It's not what you would expect. You know, may Father, Son, and Holy Ghost wish you well, a wonderful reign. He is saying, may the Holy Trinity grant that this is a fortunate event because you have truth living in this talisman that I'm giving you, this ineffable, omnipotent monad founded before all generations. One thing, if you're writing in Latin in the style of Erasmus, it's very flowery, and many people forget that that's a good way to hide things, because you might not have thought that when you read this. He's saying that the Trinity is going to bless your studies for truth by this monad, this talisman that is going to be with you, and it lives and reigns eternally, to whom alone all praise, honor, virtue, and glory shall always be offered and sung by all creatures. Then you get amen. Wow. Okay, that's the end of the letter to Maximilian. Congratulations. You're now one of the few people in the world who have actually read the whole letter and understood it. I will again apologize for the length of this video, and if I have misspoken, I'm sure that the hieroglyphic monad, as you study it more, will straighten out areas where I have misspoken. I read much more than I speak. You have an idea of what sort of ideas and wordplays will inform the 24 theorems that will soon follow. Before we get to the theorems, we have only one more video and one more class. It is short. It's Dee's instruction to printer William Sylvius. That's what we're going to do next time. Thanks again for joining me here, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.